Hi, I'm Rachel Barton Pine, and welcome to episode 10 of 24 in 24 Concertos from the Inside. Well, I learned the Dvorak concerto when I was 15 years old. I had finished learning all the most major important concertos by that point, and I was on to, well, I don't want to say the B list, but not really optional either, but, well, you know what I mean. You're not going to learn Dvorak if you haven't yet learned Brahms and Tchaikovsky. Once you have, Dvorak is kind of one of the obvious next choices that you ought to have in your repertoire. And by that point, at 15, I had already played a couple of the symphonies, some of the string quartets, the piano quintet, and of course I'd loved listening to the cello concerto for many, many years. So I already felt very in tune with Dvorak's music. Well, the first movement of this concerto is very Brahmsian in terms of the type of sound that you need from the violin, which is no coincidence because it was written for Joseph Joachim, who was the inspiration behind Brahms's violin concerto, Bruch's violin concerto, etc. And in fact, a lot of times I feel like this concerto is a stand-in for Brahms. Obviously, it's a very different animal in a way, but it's similar length. It's actually the exact same orchestration, pairs of winds, four horns, two trumpets, and a timpani. So actually a rather small complement of winds and brass, but similar to the Brahms concerto, while it can be played by a chamber orchestra, and it's definitely enjoyable to do so every so often. I definitely prefer in general to have the big, full string complement to give it that real oomph, that real thickness of sound. It's very richly orchestrated, and unlike the Brahms concerto where the violin soloist is kind of unrelentingly playing counter melody the entire time almost, in this concerto it's really a very back and forth where the violin soloist is not playing melody the whole time, but will have a bit of melody and then a bit of counter melody and then back to melody. So there's a lot of activity going on in the orchestra, which is very substantive and very much in dialogue with the violinist. And the very opening is kind of a trumpet call, da-da-dum, 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 da-yum-bum-ba-da-da-da-dum. And so it's almost like the orchestra is saying, listen up, we're about to play a great violin concerto. And then the soloist, I think it's almost like the hardest moment in the piece. There's certainly some dastardly spots here and there later on the very last page of the concerto. There's a set of fingered octaves which are quite troublesome, and there's wild runs here and there, and some tricky double stops. But the problem with the opening obviously is that it's a little more memorable and noticeable if you don't play it well. If it's some random run somewhere in the middle of the piece and you don't quite nail it, it's by in a flash, and nobody even cares, but you better get your opening right. So it definitely gives violinists, mild nightmares. But on the other hand, once you're past the opening, you're like, okay, the worst is over, the rest is smooth sailing. In the case of both Bruch and Mendelssohn, it's the orchestra making the transition with some slow, meandering music that eventually unfolds into the new movement. And in this case, the violin soloist gets to play this transitional section, which is material that doesn't exist anywhere else except for this moment. So the violinist is on the G string, very low notes the whole time, and the winds of the orchestra are playing high notes in a counter melody. Very beautiful spot. We all know it and like it by now, but when it was first written, it was a little problematic. So basically, Joachim had actually asked Dvorak to write a violin concerto for him, and Dvorak, assumed, I think it was a reasonable assumption, that everything would be smooth sailing because Joachim had already played some of Dvorak's chamber music. His best friend Brahms was also a supporter of Dvorak, and so Dvorak expected, the usual collaboration. He would write, the draft of his concerto, show it to Joachim, have a few revisions, they'd try some stuff, they'd figure out the final version, there would be a premiere, all would be well. But that's not exactly how it happened. Yet again, a rocky start to the beginning of the life of a concerto. So Joachim was very forward-thinking in so many ways. Just to give you one small example, we've talked about this in earlier episodes, but just to give you one example, the late Beethoven quartets, which everybody thought were weird experimental music, almost not meant to actually be listened to in a concert. Joachim recognized that not only could audiences certainly understand this music if presented with it, but actually enjoy it. And he and his quartet played it, these pieces, so profoundly that is indeed what happened. But despite his real, innovations in many ways, Joachim was deeply, deeply conservative. Nowadays we think of all Romantic music as the Romantic period, and we don't realize that there were different flavors of Romanticism going on and different factions who disagreed with each other. The Wagnerians thought that, Brahms and those guys were too conservative, and Brahms and those guys thought that the other guys were too modern, and they all kind of were against each other, and there was all this kind of criticism and fighting. And it's interesting because at the start of his career as a young man, Joachim actually toured with Liszt as a piano collaborative partner, and then later on kind of didn't like what Liszt was doing with his compositions, where they were too freeform for his taste, not enough traditional structure. And so Joachim couldn't deal with the fact that the first movement of Dvorak's concerto was so rhapsodic. Now, the first movement of Bruch's G minor concerto was not exactly textbook either, but Dvorak's definitely went even farther. It is a little bit stream of consciousness, and you could see why it would have given a guy like Joachim some stress to be contemplating a piece like that. He didn't like that it didn't have a real recapitulation. He didn't like that it didn't have a big tutti anywhere in the movement. It has one kind of little medium tutti, and that's about it. It didn't have a cadenza, just these little opening little thingings. And it didn't end. And the not ending thing was apparently quite the problem. And even Dvorak's publisher was trying to pressure him to end the first movement. Just give it an ending and then start the second movement like everybody else. And Dvorak, thankfully for us, really stuck to his vision. But unfortunately, sticking to his vision at the time got his concerto essentially rejected. And Joachim didn't even do it in a polite way. It's like that thing you hope that the person you're dating doesn't do. He basically stopped contacting Dvorak. They had tried it through, and Joachim wasn't satisfied. And he just basically, well, I guess in those days it was letter writing or whatever, but he basically ghosted him. And Dvorak had to kind of figure out, Joachim hasn't responded to me in a while. Maybe he's not going to respond to me. Maybe I should move on. So, yeah, Joachim didn't have the guts to just come right out and tell Dvorak once and for all, yes, I have rejected your concerto. Dvorak had to kind of figure it out, which is a little lousy. But luckily, someone who was definitely on the same page as him, artistically speaking, was the young Czech soloist Ondřej, who took up the concerto and premiered it 4 years late, but better late than never, and better 4 than 40, like the Beethoven concerto. So Ondřej championed the work, showed everybody how awesome it was, and that was that. And it's got a really lush symphonic texture, just like the first movement, and also like the first movement, a real dialogue with the members of the orchestra. And I'll show you an example. If you could pop up the picture number 1. This is the very opening of the movement, where the violin soloist does indeed have the melody. The orchestra is not accompanying, they're actually playing these really rich, substantive counter melodies, the violas, the cellos, the bassoon, and even like multiple voices of counter melodies. And so it's this really, it's just like we're all together playing a piece that has multiple parts, so that I'm maybe the first among equals, but it's definitely not soloist and orchestra down here. And then when that melody returns later on, for example, the orchestra is playing the melody, and I have this other descant. Sorry, I could just keep playing. It's so addictive. It's actually my favorite moment of the entire movement because the orchestra, after all this really lush, rich stuff, very kind of warm but active, this moment, the orchestra is very hushed, just holding these long notes, and it's a very feeling of stillness. Long, but it's just a brief oasis, a chance to catch your breath and have a moment of magic. The Furiant is a very exuberant, super energetic dance, and what's unique about this dance is that it's full of hemiolas. It's kind of 3 against 2. So, well, like in his 6th symphony, the Scherzo, you probably recognize this tune. Dum bum 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 bum. Right. So 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1. So it's like you could say 1 2 3 1 2 3, or you could go 1 2 3, like a big 3. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1. Or another way to look at it, and maybe this is why he wrote it in 3/8, is 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2. In the Furiant, in this particular movement, he actually waits all the way till measure 9 before he actually has a measure in true 3/8. So 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1, and then finally we're in our actual time signature 1 2 3 1 2. So it's kind of making the actual beat pattern, I wouldn't say indeterminate, but it's, you know, it's this playfulness with, you know, is it the big 3, is it the little 3, what's going on? But what's fun is that every time it comes back, it's different. He never does it the same way twice. The first time, I'm playing together with the other violins, very delicate and cute. So everybody's just violins and, you know, kind of... Still very, very energetic, but soft. And then later on in the movement, if you could throw up image 2, there's a very bagpipey kind of accompaniment. The violins are going, and some of the winds are holding these long drones, and so it very, very much, more than ever, has this folk music flavor. And then if you could throw up image 3, later on I have it 2 octaves lower, so not, nor, but all the way on the G string. And the violins are playing da 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 da, this kind of melodic, totally new melody on top of it. So he's very, very creative. And so as far as Dumkas, there's a very famous one in the piano quintet, of course, and an entire piano trio called the Dumki Trio. There are other chamber examples, solo piano pieces that have or are Dumkas, so lots of different examples of this in his composing catalog. And this theme comes back at the end, except now it's been transformed, so it's actually not a Dumka at all, but it's a re-envisioning of the Dumka. So he takes this melody and now he has it in major key, very triumphant. And so he brings in the exuberance of the Furiant and the rhythm of the Dumka and kind of smushes them together, and it's really great, exciting way to end the concerto.
nice to see you.
Same here. Thanks so much for joining me. I
That was
assume you're
wonderful.
home in Louisville right now?
I am. Yeah, I'm here. I'm sitting right here and watching the concert. Got my score,
Okay.
the same one from our recording. It was really nice to reopen it. All my notes and all the scribbles in the cues and the recording notes too are in here. I haven't done it since we did the recording.
Yeah, well, this is a little bit too heavy of an orchestration for what most orchestras are able to do right now, but your orchestra is one of the few that's performing live streamed concerts in person of actual orchestral repertoire right now.
That's right. Yeah, we've been playing steadily since the first week of October, actually, and we can fit about, depending on which instruments we have. If it's just strings, we can have even more, but we usually average about 30 to 35 musicians per show, and so that's actually pretty sizable with a small string section. You could fit a fair number of winds and brass, but of course they need more distance. You have to create bigger circles around them and put up plexiglass and everything like that. So yeah, I'm not sure the Dvorak would sound perfect with with the tiny string section, but we could probably manage it.
Well, hopefully we'll no longer need to in the very near future.
Yeah.
So I was
that's
fascinated
exactly
a couple of nights ago when we were talking about Dvorak and his symphonic works, and you were talking about which ones were harder and which ones were easier and which ones you would recommend that young conductors not yet attempt. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Dvorak is interesting because some pieces like this particular concerto and the sixth and seventh symphonies are really tough. They're not. They don't always feel as natural or straightforward to conduct, whereas other pieces, particularly the Eighth Symphony, is almost the ultimate starter big orchestral piece for a young conductor. I put it right up there with things like the Brahms Academic Festival Overture, Copland's Appalachian Spring. They're some of the best pieces to tackle as a starting out conductor who already knows the basic techniques, but like the Eighth Symphony is something where you breathe and you feel every beat and pulse, and it doesn't require a weird kind of finagling to get the orchestra just to kind of produce the tone that you're looking for. Whereas this period that the violin concerto comes from, which is actually around the time of the Sixth Symphony, is a little more idiosyncratic and has especially subtleties with rubato that are not always easy to bring about, and the orchestras don't necessarily do them automatically. Like they would in, say, the Slavonic dances. All that stuff is just, it's so well known and so breathable, you could say, that it comes off quite quickly. But there's a fair amount of almost operatic-like elements to the way you have to handle the rubato in this piece to make it, I think, flexible and successful in a way that feels like it really is livened and not hardened.
Yeah, well, that's a really great point because there is quite a bit of push and pull, and most of it not indicated in the score. It doesn't say poco rit and poco excel and things like that. But if you don't do that, then it's just very flat and blah. So it needs it.
That's right. Yeah. Especially the challenges differ between the movements, but the first and second movements require that real subtle touch. In terms of tempo and rubato organizing, because especially the first movement, you don't get a lot of instruction about how to pace it, and I mean on the macro scale, pacing sections and figuring out what the natural flow is, and of course that's in dialogue with you as the soloist. The second movement is different because that really does feel like you're almost conducting a bel canto kind of aria accompaniment. There's a ton of flexibility, not in just the macro, but really the micro, being able to anticipate the way you're going to turn each phrase or even turn each little figuration that occurs in a single bar. The third movement has an entirely different set of challenges, and that's just more that it's awkward rhythmically in a lot of places, that not everybody feels the hemiolas, those twos against threes, the same way. And your job is to accommodate that and make sure that there is that same unified sense of rhythm. And it's pretty easy, I think, because the orchestral part is not so technically challenging in the third movement, but your part is extremely technically challenging. So we have to be able to play in the orchestra with a sense of rhythm that has integrity, but also allows the soloist freedom to make the technical side work. It can't be so rigid that the orchestra's treating it like a pure folk dance with no play in the rhythm whatsoever. Otherwise, it would be nearly impossible for you to play your part.
Yeah, it's like that backbeat with spring to it. And I remember in the recording session, getting it tight, but then also wanting to make sure it had the right spirit. And you were so great with getting the orchestra to really, rise to their best. Well, we could easily chat for another couple of hours, but before I say goodbye and jump over to the Zoom, I want to show everybody this one Notorious hard spot. I would have mentioned it in my talk before I played the concerto, and I knew you were coming on, and I wanted to get your perspective on it. But this is one of the trickiest things to put together between soloist and orchestra, and I actually have to my job is to ignore the orchestra and play absolutely steady with my own internal beat. And then your job is to somehow come out in the same place as me at the end somehow. So if you guys could pop that up on the screen, this is spot number 6, and it's not a hemiola exactly. It's just this weird. So I'm going 1 to end, a 2 to end, a 3 to end, except it's 1 to end, a 3 to end, a 2 to end, a 1 to end, a 3 to end, a 2 to end, across 2 measures, and then the orchestra is going dun 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 dun, bum 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 bum. But off from so they're not doing their pattern against my pattern, they're doing it overlapped with my pattern, and it doesn't seem like it should be that hard, but it's like super, super hard.
It is, yeah, and I know the spot you're looking at. I have it up on my score here, and the problem, at this point, anybody who's done a lot of Dvorak just knows that those twos, but they're divided up by 3s and 3s. So 3 groups of 2s, but you're conducting 2 groups of 3s. That's very common. But when he does this strange thing, he offsets it by a single 8th note, and that's weird. That's really weird. I will say like that, and even with all the crazy rhythmic stuff that we do in Stravinsky and and John Adams, this one still is bizarre at letter U in the 3rd movement, because you're going along dun 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 da, and when it's but da da, and it's that little 8th note that's 1 ahead and the hemiola is shifted. There's something about that. It's so uncomfortable, and the only way to make it work is like I have to be so synced in to what you're doing that I can anticipate, even if there's, let's just say you surge forward by a millionth, and that's totally normal, but the conductor's job is to totally be on top of that, to feel that was natural, and to give a cue that makes everybody feel like there's no uncertainty, because I would say that percent of a percent of uncertainty is what causes entrances to not be totally together. And it's amazing that in percentages it sounds so crazy small, but the ear picks it up, even to a person that can't read a single note of music. The ear picks that up. It's so incredible how perceptive our hearing capabilities are.
Normally in this slot we do have listener questions, and you can send your question in as a written question, an audio-only track, or best of all, a video. Selfie style is just fine, and landscape view is preferred. And you can just look on the Our Concerts page right there to find where to send it. I believe the email address is info@rachelbartonpine.com, but it says it there on your screen. And we've got Mozart number 3 in G major coming up next week, Lalo Symphony Espagnole the week after that, and then many more to come thereafter. So look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.